All right, well, let's find out a little bit more about what on earth these killer robots are and why, in fact, we should be concerned here on the continent. Joining me now is Dr. Thompson Chengeta, who's a human rights law expert, and he gives us an perspective, on why Africa should be paying attention to these autonomous weapons. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Peter.
All right, so what are these killer robots? You know, I mean, it sounds like a plot in a space age movie.
Yeah, very true. Many times, actually, when we try to discuss the issue of killer robots, many people think of sci fiction, but unfortunately, at the current moment, this is no longer sci fiction, since states like the United States, Russia and other allies are actually in the process of developing these killer robots. And you ask the question, what exactly are these killer robots? Killer robots are robotic weapon systems that, once activated, are able to make the decision as to who to kill or who to harm without any human control. And as you rightfully say, they do raise far-reaching concerns for the African continent. As you may note, when these kind of weapons are being developed, the fundamental question which we ask is, in which regions, against which people are these kind of weapons likely to be deployed? And rightfully, just when we concluded the meeting of the high contracting parties to the Convention on Conventional Weapons from 13th to the 16th of November, the working group on the rights of Africans and those of African descent already has highlighted that there is racial discrimination, racial bias, and other social injustices associated with the programming and the coding of these killer robots. So if we allow them to come into existence, it is Africans and other people of color or other people from the regions which are not so powerful who will be victims of these kind of weapons.
All right. So one of your colleagues that was with you at this meeting, Haley Ramsig, had some thoughts on this as well, and this is what she said.
One of the things that I really like about the campaign to stop killer robots is that it not only talks about that, but it also highlights the issues of how these technologies can be used in policing and in border control. And of course, this will disproportionately affect people of colour, which is a concern for the working group of experts on people of African descent.
So explain that to me, discriminating people of colour. How does that work?
Thank you very much for the question, Peter. As you may know, these kind of weapons are actually programmed and coded by individuals.
Right.
So when you're talking of, have an example of current and law enforcement situations where you have seen people of color are largely targeted or discriminated against, or they're assumed actually to be the ones who are criminals in most developed parts of the world. Now, when people who are responsible for law enforcement now code, those prejudices which people may have will then also be in these kind of weapons. And the situation becomes worse because with self-learning abilities of these artificial intelligence machines, the situation will actually be quite worse. And as I said also, when I said racial discrimination is also based on the aspect of in which regions are these weapons likely to be deployed. And when you look, I just want to give you a brief historical perspective on this issue of weapons. The aspect of weapons being associated with racial discrimination is not new. If you go as far back as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where atomic bombs were used, the question has ever been asked by many scientific scholars to say, there were many states who were participating in the World War. What made the choice? What informed the choice for them to be dropped in Nagasaki in Japan?
How urgent is this situation? Have these weapons been mechanized and deployed already?
This issue is very, very, very urgent. Actually, our campaign, we've been calling for a legally binding instrument banning these killer robots, and we were hoping that it was supposed to happen by end of this year. Yet countries that are developing them, that is the United States and Russia and others, they are actually blocking this idea of states saying we want to ban killer robots. As you have noted, there are many scientists, there are many states who have called to say we need to ban these killer robots. And from the African perspective, The African Group on Disarmament is also in support of this idea to say we need to ban killer robots. Why? Because it's emergent. Right now, states are at a really advanced stage of developing these weapons, and once they start fielding them, it will be really, really too late.
So again, getting to this artificial intelligence story. So the scenario is they set a drone or whatever it is off to do a mission. It will be in a village and it will have to make a decision. Now, it may not have been programmed to make a decision between a young adult who looks like an old person or a woman who looks like something else, and will make a decision to shoot someone. It doesn't have the instincts of human beings. And that's where innocent lives can be lost.
Very, very true. You know, they lack that, machines do lack human empathy. They don't have situational awareness or intuition to feel anything or sorry for whoever they are targeting. Makes the situation worse. But I just want to say something regarding the aspect where you say when they arrive on the battlefield or in law enforcement, how do they target? So the person who is programming them, for example, what are called signature strikes, which the United States have been talking about. This is where the one who is programming says you arrive on the battlefield or in the law enforcement situation, you see an individual who is a male individual between the age of 15 and 20. You see a male individual who has got a long beard. Now, this is what we are calling racism, because you are profiling individuals on the basis of how they look. They are likely to be criminals. And when we are saying African states need to participate, we've been calling on African states, and whilst we are really appreciative, for example, of South Africa, which is always present in the discussions on autonomous weapon systems. South Africa needs to take a leading role, especially on the African continent. Other African states, Zimbabwe, Ghana, recently Namibia in New York, have clearly come out and say we need to ban killer robots. So we are actually urging South Africa in particular to take a position, because so far, whilst they have participated in the discussions, South Africa has not taken a position. And our encouragement is to say, given states especially we have experienced racism in other racial discrimination or other social injustices, perhaps it's for South Africa to take a lead on this debate.
All right. So has it been discussed at African Union gatherings, for example?
Thank you very much for that question. Actually, at the level of regional level, which we are now engaging, it is the African Group on Disarmament in Geneva, which has made two statements actually to the United Nations saying we want to ban these killer robots. We are also trying at the moment to engage with the Pan-African Parliament, also the African Union, to make those kind of statements. Why is it important? You're right for the regional level organizations to make these decisions. Recently in 2018, the European Parliament made a resolution which it said all European countries actually should not develop this kind of weapons because they violate not only the law of armed conflict but a plethora of human rights.
Okay. All right. So, again, this concern that the programmers are the ones that might make the mistakes and profile certain people. But the other side of the coin, though, is you will meet situations where there are terrorists operating somewhere. And by deploying these kinds of autonomous weapons, you can save lives, innocent lives. You don't put soldiers on the battlefront to get killed by people who are killing people.
Usually, you're right, that argument is made a number of times by the United States and those who are developing them. But I'm sorry to say that's a false argument. It's not true. Because when I say look at the context of how these killer robots will be used, when you're saying there's no deployment of soldiers on the ground, you're correct. For the state who is deploying them, they may make that argument. But when you're talking about saving the lives of civilians, that's not true. Why? Because if you look at armed drones, which have already been used, they have heightened the number of civilians on account of this idea that where, for example, someone believes there's a high target terrorist, the death of 30 or more civilians is regarded as normal or as proportional. That is not correct. So this idea that if we deploy machines, it means that lives of civilians will be saved is premised on the false idea that perhaps when these robotic weapons arrive on a law enforcement situation or on the battlefield, they will be able to distinguish who is a terrorist and who is not. And one of the critical arguments which we've been saying is that and supported by roboticists and other scientists. It's impossible for weapon systems to have that situational awareness, human judgment that is necessary for you to comply with the laws of war and with human rights. So you may actually find that it exacerbates the number of civilians who are going to be killed. And the situation here is the situation when human soldiers commit these crimes. I'm not saying human soldiers have not been doing terrible things, Peter. They have. But at least the upside of it is that there is someone to hold accountable.
Right.
You know, this issue of accountability where you can say, it is you who did this. But in the use or deployment of killer robots, there's this accountability gap. Who are you going to hold accountable when these kind of weapons
can
are
malfunction with
exactly
great loss of life? Dr. Chengeta, we're going to have to leave it there, but I think again these are conversations that we need to keep having and keeping in people's minds, because decisions are being made on our behalf. Thanks so much indeed for raising this issue with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's where we're going to leave that for the time being. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back we'll have more on SA Today. In fact, we'll be back at the top of